Hey, Meg and Dr. G here, and today we are speaking with two amazing women, former competitive swimmer, world record holder, and silver medalist Allison Wagner joins us as the Director of Athlete and International Relations at USADA, the United States Anti-Doping Agency, and Dr. Laura Lewis, who, as Director of Science at USADA, provides scientific expertise across testing result management and educational programs while leading the athlete biological passport testing programs. Ladies, welcome to SPKN.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Meg and Dr. G.
Thank you. Well, nice to meet you as well, Dr. Lewis.
Now, Allison, you received a silver medal in the 400-meter individual medley at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, good. I got it right. Tell us a little bit about how that went and how you that led to where you are now at USADA.
Yeah, so I swam the individual medley events and specialized in the 200 and 400, did some breaststroke events and as well. But yeah, so I competed in the 90s and again in 2005 to 8. And I, in the mid 90s, raced against some athletes who were later proven to have doped. And those experiences really affected my sport career, but also my life. And in watching the Russia scandal unfold, I realized that so many athletes around the world would be experiencing what I did as a clean athlete, which was a real lack of faith that the system worked, and suffering injustice and all of the costs that athletes pay in those situations. I understand, and I was motivated to try and help. So I eventually ended up here at USADA and glad to be a part of the effort to protect clean athletes.
That's wonderful. There's so many times that athletes have things that go on during their career that lead them to such great work. So thank you for doing that. Laura, do you want to share a little bit about how you came to USADA?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Australian and I did my PhD at the Australian Institute of Sport, so in the High Performance Network in Australia. And the early parts of my career, I was working, I guess, on the front line, supporting athletes to try and improve their performance through various physiological and completely, legal means. But then as my career evolved, I realized that, I was always going to be on the periphery in that kind of role, and that my effect on clean sport was quite limited. And so I really wanted to move into anti-doping to work on more of a global scale and have as big an impact in terms of clean sport and serving a wider range of athletes as possible. So I started to do a lot of anti-doping research back in Australia. And then when the opportunity came to join USADA, I jumped at it because USADA is really pushing the forefront of anti-doping on a global scale, and I wanted to be part of it.
But you want to talk about just a little bit more about your background or educational background as well. Like, what if somebody wants to get involved in this kind of research and organizational setting? But what would be a recommended course or study, and how to start doing that?
Yeah, so there's a number of different angles and avenues that you could come through on. For me personally, I did a Bachelor of Sport and Exercise Science, and then went on to do a PhD in exercise physiology. And through that, I had the understanding of how athletes train and how the body works and responds to different stimuli. So then moving through into anti-doping was kind of a natural step. But you could also come through it through more a clinical lab kind of direction, where you're actually, working in a laboratory and really trying to understand and advance the testing that we actually do of the samples of athletes when they come through there. So there's many different options. And then of course there's the administrative or managerial kind of avenue where you're more working on the governance structure or the test planning and the policies. So plenty of different options for people wanting to get into this space.
Well, that's enough for the niceties. Let me ask you a real tough one. Why do we even need USADA? I mean, what if people want to drink, rat poison to run faster? Do we really need to worry about that? Isn't that going to take care of itself? I'm obviously kidding, but
yeah, what I'll say is that level playing field is a really important part of sport. And anti-doping is a part of that effort. So, most people get to know the rules of play as an athlete, whatever sport they're participating in, there are rules of play. And, those rules of play, they create a level playing field in a lot of regards. And anti-doping is an extension of that. The effort is to create an environment of fairness, respect, and integrity. And for athletes to have that confidence that it's a level playing field in terms of rules being followed by everybody, that's part of the anti-doping role in the world of sport. I'll pass on to Laura if you have something else to say.
Yeah, I guess I just pick up from what you said about the rules for everybody. And so that's not just everybody in the US, it's everybody around the world. And so there's an overarching body, the World Anti-Doping Agency, that dictate the rules and the code that we all have to abide by, and then the prohibited list, which are the actual substances and methods that are also prohibited. So everybody around the world signs up to the code and the prohibited list, and then that's really where that level playing field that Alison spoke about, really comes to the fore, because the same rules apply whether you're in Kenya or the UK or Australia or the US, so that athletes, the goal is that athletes can turn up to these international events knowing that, they should be subject to the same standards. Whether or not that actually happens is a different question, but, we're all bound by the same set of rules.
And when we're talking about then and taking it to USADA, when you think about the US context in USADA, I guess, I don't know, do you have any touch points that you would like to touch on regarding the US differences internationally and other really cool programs and elite institutes like AIS or Erasmus and other kind of enterprises like that I don't think we tend to see in the US. I think the US is a little bit more isolated than some of the international models and the collaborations that you see, especially in Europe, because of their different proximities.
Well, I just say, like, in terms of, I think we were talking about two different things, in that I think the US is certainly leading the charge in terms of anti-doping, and our North Star is like serving athletes, and that is not necessarily the same in other countries where it might be more of a bureaucratic government organization that has a different mandate and a different mission, whereas our mission is, we put our athletes front and center, and we're there to serve them and to protect clean sport, which is different around the world.
And I think it's also an interesting note that people in the US or beyond may not always realize, is that in the US, we don't have a sports ministry, and many countries around the world, most have sports ministries. So these are areas of the government that are involved in sport. We don't have that here. And another point of possible interest is that USADA really is an independent organization. And this is a really important note for an organization like this that is a regulatory body. And we operate under the world regulatory body, WADA. And we here at USADA really appreciate our independence to do what's right by clean athletes.
Alison, I'd like to hear your experience from an athlete's perspective, going through the testing process. What was it like? What did it have any impact on you? You know, you're in the Olympics, you're focused on your sport and your competition. Does it have any mental, like, oh God, I got to go do this? I mean, I don't personally know the testing process, so maybe we can just kind of throw that out there a little bit.
As an athlete at the elite level, in Olympic and Paralympic sport, you're required to, and we can go into details on how that elite level is defined, but I'll just play it as simple as possible. But at the elite level, you're required to be located for testing out of competition. So you fill out what's called whereabouts filings, and this information allows you to be found for testing at home, at school, at training, and then you expect to be tested in competitions as well. And so what's involved is in and out of competition test. So when I was an athlete, I would get tested at home or the swimming pool, and somebody shows up and identifies themselves, and the process starts. You have to submit a urine sample, maybe a blood sample, and then you know, that's it. But it's a pretty extensive process, and it's a pretty extensive responsibility, I would say, for the elite athlete in the Olympic and Paralympic sport. I was really happy to do it because fairness was really important to me. And, you know, I really identify and always have since I was a kid with the Olympic values of pursuing excellence with integrity. You know, I wanted to express that part of me through sport. And it was really, you know, a lot for me about honor and representing my country. On the other hand, sport governance systems and anti-doping systems, I think, have a lot of room for improvement in terms of being athlete informed and having athletes as a part of these governance structures. So I would really love to see sport move in that direction so that athletes have, you know, a say in how these structures are formed and implemented, and how the system of sport internationally in the Olympic and Paralympic world is governed. And so we have I can go into those details, but we have a far way to go in the global setting to having that happen. And defining, you know, who can play part in that is also an important part of that discussion. But, you know, I really, this is what I love about my job, is that, you know, advocating for athletes is something that needs to be more incorporated into organizations like USADA, like Olympic committees, like governing bodies of all kinds. And these athletes, all athletes, deserve to have collectively a voice that impacts these systems, because their lives are being impacted by these systems and also failures in the systems. And athletes have a lot of expertise that I know is not considered in certain settings, and also people need to be educated on what that expertise looks like and how it can be valued and incorporated.
Laura, is there anything else that you think athletes or coaches, parents should know about the protocols and policies?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Alison explained briefly about the whereabouts and the testing process, but that's underpinned by all the different rules and, you know, what substances you are allowed to take, what substances you're not allowed to take. But what if you need to take something because you've got a legitimate medical condition that requires that? And of course, an athlete's health is, you know, should be first and foremost. So there's a process known as therapeutic use exemptions, or TUEs, and athletes can apply for one of those by providing all their medical records. And, you know, this goes to a committee, and they scrutinize everything and then decide whether or not it is fair and appropriate in the sporting context for the athlete to use that medication, because basically they want to protect other athletes about an unfair advantage that might be made with using that particular substance. But the TUE process can be quite complicated, and there's different rules depending on the different level that the athlete is competing at. And so we have a really important team here at USADA, our education team, and it's their job to go out and to educate and to provide all the resources. And we have a goal that no athlete should be tested without having access to that education and being brought up to speed on everything. So it can be a little overwhelming at first, if you are a parent or an athlete, to just click on the website and what do I need to know? But our education team and also our outreach program, True Sport, do a really great job of distilling the information and explaining it, and then pointing you in the direction of the right resources that you need.
Can you both tell us a little bit about the scope of USADA then, and like how many athletes, how many organizations, how many tests get performed annually? Like what's it kind of look like as an organization? I'm thinking that this is a really challenging system to operate in with so many different moving parts.
Yeah, so our core business in terms of the testing is our Olympic and Paralympic programs, and that's where we receive federal money to actually go out and test the Olympic and Paralympic athletes. So we have about between 2,000 and 3,000 athletes in the registered testing pool, and those are the ones that are supplying the whereabouts information, and that we are testing on a regular basis. And WADA, the World Anti-Doping Organization, gives us certain requirements that we have to test some of these athletes a minimum number of times per year. Some will get even more testing than that, depending on how often they're competing. So those are the Olympic and Paralympic sports. And then if you're not part of that registered testing pool, there's still an obligation to know the rules. And so that's where our education teams are reaching out to all of those athletes. And then in our True Sport program, we're going down to the grassroots level and really making sure that we are educating everybody on the Olympic values, the values of clean sport, right from the early stages. So as they're moving up through the ranks, this is already ingrained in them. They're all already understanding the values that are so important to us.
And to connect there, Allison, with your point earlier too, if you're looking at the system and you're advocating for athletes, where do you find there's an entry point? Like what's an example of how you could advocate, or how could we change the system to better accommodate athletes' needs and desires?
So for example, WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, just concluded their latest reform efforts, and they collected and heard feedback from various groups around the world involved in anti-doping. And, we align with what our U.S. Athletes Advisory Council wanted, which was a more open, fair, democratic process for athletes to get involved in the governance of WADA. And, that's something that USADA advocates for generally, but this is something that I was referring to earlier, and that it's so important for athletes to have this chance to be heard, but also play a role in the governance processes.
I guess, one of the things that comes to mind that I've read and seen some of the research and social media is athletes talking about like, hey, I'm getting tested from the whereabouts, right? Like, one, you're tracking me all the time, so there's a little bit of a privacy issue, but also I feel like I'm being over tested, or I've been tested on, kind of sequential occasions or weeks or months or something like that. And it doesn't seem to have a real effort into testing policy in terms of fair play. It seems just kind of redundant. I don't know if either one of you two, is that a thing that needs to happen because of the way that performance enhancing substances and drugs use can play in performance, and we have to test that regularly? Or is it more of a random decision-making factor?
So I can tell you, Dr. G, that we don't do random random testing. It might appear random to people, but random testing has been shown through the research to not have an effective detection or deterrence piece. So the goal of our testing is twofold. Firstly, we want to detect if anyone's using a performance enhancing substance, and the timing of that, when someone might use a performance enhancing substance, will depend on the substance itself and the sport and the time of year. And so, it might make more sense in some sports to use something more in the early season or the off season, whereas in other sports, depending on the substance, the time frame might be shorter, the competition. So we have to take all of that into account. And so the whole idea of that you can be tested anywhere at any time is really trying to get at both the detection, as I said, but also at deterrence. So if we can deter athletes from doping, that's obviously a win for us as well. The challenge is that, if we were terrible at detecting people, we'd end up with 0 positive tests. And if we're absolutely amazing at deterring everyone from doping, we'd also end up with 0 positive tests. So it's quite hard to, ascertain exactly our success. But I guess I'd say to your point that, we are, as an organization, really trying to be as strategic as possible with our testing. We're trying to make sure that we aren't over testing athletes if we can avoid it. So we're trying to be really thoughtful in our test assignments and put them out there to meet the needs of detection and deterrence, and also to meet our requirements on a global stage as to what's considered a fair amount of testing for athletes.
Yeah, and I'd add to anyone listening, if you're one of those athletes, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm sure the contact information will be shared via the podcast notes. But yeah, I think that it's important to look at as an athlete, look at what's important to you and what your concerns are. Of course, pass those on to us and get in touch. But also, the goal is to keep the playing field level in terms of doping. And so, if an athlete thinks about, some of the athletes I competed against, for example, the woman I won a silver medal to, she cheated the anti-doping system and evaded the system for a while. And this is something that we're trying to, as a global anti-doping community, prevent from happening. So we want to test athletes. We want to know that they're clean. We want to catch those athletes that are trying to cheat other athletes out of that level playing field, and create those injustices for other athletes, and take those opportunities both in achieving fairness, but also career opportunities away from other athletes. So, we are really focused on protecting that clean sport environment. So I understand the concerns, and as an athlete, former athlete, I certainly understand the burden of the system. But I also understand the importance of catching cheaters and what that can do if they're not caught to the sport and also to individuals.
Yeah, it sounds like, to summarize it, it's a price you pay for competing at that level.
Yeah, it's part of the system at that level. Yeah.
I get, Laura, too. I'm thinking too, like, and I'm not a biochemistry, right? I do have an exercise science undergraduate degree, but how many folks, or have you got folks right in this game of doping and trying to cover up doping and not get caught in the system? How is the science advancing and changing, trying to develop new technologies to catch the latest designer substances? Who are those folks in the labs doing that kind of stuff? Like that seems like hardcore science work right there.
Yeah. Well, around the world, there's a number of WADA accredited laboratories. So that's where all our samples will go to for analysis. Every sample collected as part of the WADA code needs to be analyzed at the WADA lab. And we're really connected to that community. It's quite small, I guess it's quite niche, but those labs are really trying to, constantly advance the research to improve their detection capabilities. And at USADA, we pride ourselves on being really connected. So we can tell, through various intel or our experiences, we will collaborate directly with those laboratories for specific questions that we might have. There's an example, and I hope I can summarize this succinctly enough, but we had a couple of cases last year where some athletes were testing positive for a metabolite of a prohibited substance, and they were trying to work out where this was. Was it some sort of contamination? Should they be testing their supplements? They were maintaining their innocence, and through their detailed records, we were able to track down that they were using various cosmetic products that ended up having a substance within those cosmetic products that metabolized to the same substance. So it didn't have the cosmetics didn't have the prohibited substance. There was nothing wrong with taking them, but once they were in the body, they were metabolized, broken down into this exact same substance that was then flagging as a positive test. And this is a terrible situation for athletes to be in. So we had a member of staff, our chief science officer, actually using a sunscreen, lathering himself up and producing urine samples and sending them off to a lab in the US. Meanwhile, we had a lab in Europe also investigating the same thing. And we were able to prove, this chain of events coming from there, and actually get WADA to change the rules so that this metabolite, if it showed up, it had to have further investigation, and that you could prove that it had come from either the prohibited substance or the cosmetic. And actually at in Tokyo, I think, that probably avoided a lot of athletes who were obviously using sunscreen from ending up with an unfair positive test. So I guess that's an example of how, USADA, we don't just sit on our laurels. If we see a problem that requires investigation and further research, we want to be on the forefront to try and uncover what's actually going on and make the system fairer.
Well, and supplements and all this stuff you see on YouTube, which just drives me crazy, but there's so much misinformation on YouTube about, oh, I'm a nutritionist and I've got this great thing, it's going to make you perform so much better. How do you, as an athlete, how do you find it? And I've heard stories of coaches who have actually been giving stuff in supplements and athletes just taking them. Do you have any advice on how to kind of pick up on those things, or maybe parents, what you're looking for to kind of see if it's happening without your knowledge?
Yeah, we advocate for a food first approach in regards to supplements. And also on our site, you can search for Supplement Connect and also Global Drove as two resources for supplements and medications to, get some education around those topics.
And I guess I'd say to athletes or parents, coaches out there looking at a supplement, if the supplement has all these wild claims that it's going to do all this to your performance, that should be your biggest red flag. Why does only that supplement, is able to have the scientific research to back that? If it would have got out by now, to a wider audience. So just be careful of, if the supplement label is listing all these things, has a lot of ingredients that you don't understand, and has complicated, names of chemical structures, you should really start to be thinking about whether or not this is something that's appropriate for you to be using.
Well, and then what's the USADA kind of position then on performance enhancing as well as safety? What if we end up with designer supplements and drugs that are safe, that don't lead to a spike in negative health outcomes, but they also are shown to increase performance?
So for a substance to end up on the WADA prohibited list,
Yeah, or off the list too.
yeah, so it's usually three, it needs to fill 2 of 3 criteria. So there's has the potential to enhance performance. It has the potential to be harmful to an individual. And then it also contravenes the spirit of sport. So that whole fair play, level playing field angle. And there's a list committee that every year they review the list, and some things might end up being taken off, some things might end up being added onto the list. And they're really assessing each of those, each substance by those three criteria. So often if it is not any harmful to health, you will find that it still ends up being on the list because of the potential to enhance performance and the contravening the spirit of sport.
So, for example, like creatine monohydrate, is creatine on the list or off the list?
Off.
So I can use creatine.
Yes. So a lot of the things that, might be a supplement there, they still require the body to do a bit of work. You take creatine and it's not a given that that's going to enhance your performance. It's all to do with, your training schedule as well, when you're taking it, how your body adapts. Whereas if you take EPO, we know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to enhance your performance. So EPO is banned. Creatine, and a lot of other substances like caffeine, it all depends on how it's used, and also its impact on performance is fairly minimal and variable.
And I would really encourage athletes to be analytical about these things as they are about their performances and their competitions and their training. Be attuned to your body and also analyze these things for yourself. Somebody says this is guaranteed is safe. That just, it doesn't, it's a human body. And there are certain things we really understand and know about the human body, but you just don't, our bodies and natural sciences don't operate in guarantees. It's more about trends and things like that. I'd say too, in studying ethics, one of the most important skills you can do as an athlete in maintaining your own integrity is to, evaluate, like I said earlier, evaluate everything for yourself, take advice, listen to those advisors around you that you trust and that have shown themselves to be trustworthy to yourself and others. But also really listen to yourself and your own wisdom, and trust your analytical skills and things along those lines, because you will, at the elite level, you will be held accountable for these choices you make, but if they do end up in a positive test or that scenario. But more importantly, you want to be able to live comfortably with yourself and really feel comfortable with your decisions, and be realistic about your body and performance. And I find most athletes at the elite level are, because you have to be realistic, and to achieve excellence, most athletes know, like, you won't have a perfect competition most, if not all of the time, but you may really excel in some areas that get you a personal best or an Olympic medal or something along those lines. But when you get to those levels, that these are not perfect scenarios, and there are a lot of factors playing in. And treat your body, and I know many athletes do, but for everybody else listening, understand that the body and the science behind these things are you know, they're well researched, but there's also, you know, these claims out there that just don't make sense if you understand the basic workings of a human body or you know, the natural sciences. So, you know, trust yourself in your evaluation of that.
So what I'm hearing is you get one body. That's it. Take care of it. If it sounds too good to be true, probably is. And it's okay to question. I think there's a lot of people who feel that the power of the coach, you know, that he controls or she controls how much I play or what my success level is going to be. It's okay to question it. And one of the reasons we are developing the research database that we are is so that people like athletes have the access to check things out for themselves. And so question. It's okay to question.
Yeah, and I'd really ask that parents and coaches and people around athletes encourage that. You know, I did my thesis work in safe sport. So, you know, one of the risk factors in safe sport topics is, you know, this authoritarian approach to coaching in sport, because oftentimes young athletes are trained, especially young elite athletes are trained to never question and just listen and do what you're told. And it sets up a really toxic imbalance, not only for that athlete's personal development, but for their athletic success. You know, most athletes realize when they're competing, they have to listen to their bodies in order to excel. But in those relationships, they should be taught to think critically, because you will have to think for yourself when you're in a competition and after your sport career, and, you know, in many other scenarios, but it's only a part of the healthy process of becoming a better person and athlete.
And if I can maybe connect that, it seems to me if you're an athlete just listening to your coach or doing what you're told, you know, and the coach starts giving you some supplements or some shakes to drink or some cream to put on you, and you just kind of nod your head and go along with it because that's the coach, and supposedly the coach has your best interest in mind, but you know, they're really kind of slipping you something that they shouldn't be, that's on a banned list.
And at the end of the day, the rules apply to you as the athlete. Like there are rules that apply to the coach too, but you're gonna just saying that my coach gave me this is not gonna get you off a sanction. So athletes are responsible for what's put in their body. So absolutely, like it is okay to question, and it's not just okay, like it's almost imperative that you do. Yeah.
Well, before we wrap stuff up here, there's one more question I want to talk about, and that is two specific substances that kind of are being talked about quite a bit right now. The first is marijuana and using it for recovery, and what the view is on that. And then also testosterone, and what aspect of that does USADA kind of encapsulate?
In terms of marijuana, Olympic and Paralympic sport, it is prohibited to be used in competition at this time. So, you know, that's what we educate, that is the rule. This is what we educate our athletes on. Okay. You know, so there are, you know, reviews happening on this substance. And I can tell you from my sport ethics studies that there are a lot of researchers analyzing this substance and understanding, you know, how it interacts with sports and different sports. And generally, I would say, and you correct me if you have a different perspective, Laura, but I would say the science community, in the ethics community, you know, would say it's unknown as to, you know, a consensus on performance enhancement in marijuana. So there's that.
I guess the thing to add to that is, Alison said absolutely correctly, it's prohibited in competition, but what's not known is how long it takes to leave your system once you use it. So, and that's dependent on, you know, the individual, how their body metabolizes marijuana, but also how often they've used it, how much they've used, the dose, you know. So there's no hard and fast rule that if you're competing on the Sunday and you stop using marijuana on the Monday, that you you won't return a positive test on the Sunday. So this is where, you know, marijuana is a really difficult subject for us to navigate in the anti-doping space because of that rule that it's only prohibited in competition, but the washout periods and the clearance is so difficult to determine.
I think there's quite a bit of research going on about that as people are trying to use it in different areas. Testosterone, I know that it's in the news a lot because of transgender issues and levels and that sort of thing. What part does USADA play in testosterone as a performance enhancing?
Yeah, so synthetic testosterone is on the prohibited list and is prohibited at all times across all sports. So that is one of the key steroids that we are testing for in our testing programs. The interesting, or the slight issue, I guess, with testing for testosterone is that all our bodies naturally produce it anyway. So the way that we end up having to test for testosterone is that we're not looking for like a specific level in the blood. We're actually looking at a ratio between testosterone to another hormone called epitestosterone, and that ratio fluctuates and is also higher in males than females. And so first of all, we're looking, every sample is analyzed to produce, I guess, we call it a longitudinal passport. So, you know, the life cycle, I guess, of your TE ratio throughout, you know, your testing career. And then if that changes, you know, dramatically up or down, we might then do another special type of analysis that can determine whether the source of that testosterone, so whether it's come from a synthetic exogenous source outside of your body, or whether it's just that's what you're naturally producing. So that's our role in terms of testing for testosterone. So we are not involved in eligibility at all. So we will not be testing athletes to say your testosterone levels are below this, you are now eligible to compete in your sport. But we test all athletes for the prohibited use of testosterone, and that's the same across the board.
Anyway, well, this has been wonderful. Thank you both for taking the time to talk to us and our viewers, and we really appreciate your expertise and your time.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.